You don't belong in this room. The sentence didn't echo. It sliced, sharp and deliberate, cutting clean through the soft hum of crystal glasses and polite laughter that had filled the Grand Regency ballroom just seconds before, and every head turned not because of the volume, but because of the certainty behind it, the kind of certainty that assumes agreement before it's earned. And standing beneath a cascade of golden light, Naomi Carter didn't move. Not when the white-gloved hostess stepped closer, not when a few nearby guests leaned in with curiosity dressed as concern, and not even when the final act of disrespect landed. Frosting, light and cold, smeared across the side of her face from a decorative cake meant for celebration, not humiliation, and for a moment, the entire room held its breath, suspended between discomfort and amusement, unsure which direction to follow. And then someone laughed. Just one, soft and uncertain. But it was enough, because laughter spreads faster than truth in rooms like this. And within seconds, it multiplied, polite smiles turning into quiet chuckles, eyes flickering with that familiar calculation. Is this acceptable? Is she supposed to be here? And Naomi Carter stood in the center of it all, dressed in a tailored black evening gown with no visible label, no glittering diamonds announcing her worth, no entourage signaling her status, just presence, still and grounded, as if the marble beneath her heels had decided to anchor itself to her, and she didn't lift a hand to wipe the frosting away, didn't react with shock or anger or embarrassment. She simply looked up, slow and deliberate, her gaze moving across the room, not in confusion but in recognition, like someone who had seen this moment before, not once, not twice, but enough times to know exactly how it ends. And the hostess, Emily Rhodes, stood there with a tight smile, chin slightly raised, as if she had just corrected a mistake that needed correcting. Wrong table, wrong guest, she said, her voice light, but edged with something colder, something practiced. And a few people nodded without realizing they were doing it, because authority doesn't always come from truth. Sometimes it comes from tone, and Naomi's eyes lingered on her for half a second longer than expected, not confrontational, not pleading, just steady, as if she were committing the moment to memory. And somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a server paused mid-step, tray hovering just slightly off balance, watching in a way that suggested this wasn't right, but not yet wrong enough to interrupt. And near the stage, a man in a navy suit shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his phone, then back at Naomi, then away again. Because discomfort in rooms like this rarely becomes action, it becomes silence, and silence, in moments like this, is louder than anything else. And Naomi finally moved, not to defend herself, not to argue, but to reach into the small clutch at her side, her movements unhurried, precise, and she pulled out her phone, the screen lighting her face just enough to catch the faint trace of frosting still resting along her cheek. And she held it there for a second, not dialing yet, just looking at it, as if giving the room one last opportunity to correct itself. And no one did. Not Emily. Not the event director who had just stepped closer with a furrowed brow and a rehearsed look of concern. Not the guest who had started whispering behind raised glasses. And that was all the confirmation she needed. And when she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise, didn't demand attention. It simply existed, clear and controlled, cutting through the noise without competing with it. Daniel, she said into the phone, and even that single name seemed to shift something in the air, subtle but real, like a change in pressure before a storm. Freeze all outgoing commitments, she continued, her tone steady, unshaken, and pull the full allocation, all of it. And there was a pause on the other end, not of confusion, but of execution, the kind of silence that comes when instructions are understood immediately. And Naomi didn't look around to gauge reactions, didn't wait for acknowledgement. She simply lowered the phone slightly, her eyes returning to the room, and for the first time, the laughter didn't grow, it hesitated, because something in her voice hadn't matched the role they had assigned to her, and people noticed that, even if they don't admit it. And Emily's smile faltered just enough to reveal uncertainty beneath it. I think you should leave, she said, this time with less polish and more insistence, as if repeating the line would restore control. But Naomi didn't respond to the instruction. She didn't move toward the exit. She didn't apologize or explain. She just stood there, still anchored. And then, almost imperceptibly, the first phone buzzed, a short vibration that barely registered beyond the pocket it came from, and then another, and another, until the room, once filled with curated elegance, began to fill with something else entirely. Alerts, notifications, the quiet chaos of systems reacting in real time, and a man near the stage pulled out his phone, his expression shifting from mild irritation to confusion, then to something sharper, something closer to concern, and across the room, a woman in a silver dress frowned at her screen, whispering to the person beside her, "That can't be right." And the event director, who had been preparing to step in more forcefully, paused mid-stride as his own phone lit up, his eyes scanning quickly, then again, slower this time, as if hoping the information would change if he read it twice. And Naomi watched none of it directly, but she felt it, the shift, the subtle unraveling that starts not with noise, but with realization, and she finally lifted her hand, not to wipe the frosting away, but to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, composed gesture that somehow carried more authority than anything said so far. And when she spoke again, it wasn't louder, but it was heavier, each word landing with the kind of weight that doesn't need volume to be heard. "You didn't make a scene," she said, her eyes resting briefly on Emily, then moving past her to the room as a whole. "You made a decision," and the room, now quieter than before, listened in a way it hadn't just moments ago, because the script had changed, and they could feel it, even if they didn't yet understand how far it would go. And somewhere near the back, the server who had paused earlier set the tray down, no longer pretending this was just another night, and the man in the navy suit took a step forward, as if pulled by something he couldn't quite name, and Naomi Carter stood there, frosting still untouched, phone still in her hand, presence still anchored, as the first layer of certainty in the room began to crack, quietly, but completely. The room did not erupt, it unraveled slowly, like something expensive coming apart at the seams one thread at a time, and the first thing to go was certainty, because people who had been smiling just moments ago were now staring at their phones with the kind of focus that ignores everything else, and one man, near the front, let out a quiet breath that sounded more like disbelief than surprise. "That is not possible," he murmured, but he did not look up when he said it, because whatever was on his screen mattered more than the woman still standing with frosting on her cheek, and across the ballroom a cluster of investors leaned toward each other, their voices low but urgent, no longer performing politeness, but chasing clarity, and the event director, whose confidence had filled the room earlier, now stood completely still, his phone in his hand, his eyes scanning again and again, as if repetition might reverse what he was seeing. And Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence unshaken, as if the room had begun to move around her instead of the other way around, and Emily Rhodes felt it before. She understood it, the shift in attention, the quiet withdrawal of support that had been invisible until it was gone, because moments ago the room had echoed her tone, and now it no longer did, and she straightened her shoulders, stepping forward, as if proximity could restore control. "I do not know what you think you are doing," she said, her voice sharper now, less curated, less certain. "But this is a private event, and you are not authorized to remain here." And the words landed, but they did not carry the same weight, because the room was no longer listening to her the way it had before, and Naomi did not interrupt. She did not argue. She simply looked at her for a second longer than necessary, and then shifted her gaze slightly past her to the wider room, and that movement alone seemed to confirm something for the people watching, that whatever was happening did not revolve around Emily anymore. And another phone buzzed louder, this time followed by the soft chime of an incoming message, amplified by the silence that had settled over the ballroom, and a woman in a gold dress covered her mouth as she read something on her screen. "They just pulled out," she whispered, not intending to be heard, but the words traveled anyway, because in rooms like this, whispers carry further than announcements, and the man beside her leaned in quickly. "Who pulled out?" he asked, and she shook her head slowly. "All of them," she said, her voice barely above a breath, and the phrase did not need clarification, because the implication was already expanding through the room like a ripple through still water. And the event director took a step toward Naomi, now his earlier authority replaced with something closer to urgency. "Ma, I am going to need you to explain what exactly you just did," he said, and his tone was careful, now measured in a way that suggested he understood that this conversation was no longer optional. and Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement of the question itself, as if she were deciding whether it deserved an answer. And when she spoke, her voice remained even almost quiet, but there was something in it now that had not been there before, not anger, not pride, but finality. I did not do anything to you, she said. I removed myself from what you were depending on. And the distinction settled over the room in a way that shifted perspective, because removal implies ownership, and ownership implies authority, and people were starting to connect those ideas whether they wanted to or not. And Emily let out a small, incredulous laugh, trying to reclaim ground that had already slipped away. You are talking like you control something here, she said, but the words came out thinner than intended, and Naomi did not look at her when she answered. I do not talk like anything, she replied. I act. And that was when the screens at the far end of the ballroom flickered, not dramatically, not with a crash or a blackout, but with a subtle shift in content. The scheduled presentation replaced by a blank interface, followed by a line of text that appeared simple but carried weight. Funding status updated. And beneath it a series of numbers began to change in real time, and the room collectively leaned toward it as if drawn by gravity, because numbers do not lie the way people do, and those numbers were moving fast and downward. And the master of ceremonies, who had been waiting backstage, stepped halfway into view, then stopped, his script forgotten in his hand, as he looked at the screen, then at the crowd, then back at the screen again. And no one needed an explanation, because the evidence was visible and immediate and impossible to dismiss. And the man in the navy suit, who had stepped forward earlier, now closed the distance between himself and Naomi, completely not in confrontation, but in recognition. Are you the one behind Carter Holdings? He asked, his voice low but direct, and Naomi's eyes met his for the first time with something that resembled confirmation without the need for a formal statement. Yes, she said simply, and the word carried more weight than any title could have, because the room already knew what Carter Holdings represented: a $4.2 billion investment commitment that had been the foundation of the entire evening. And the air shifted again, this time not with confusion, but with realization, and Emily's expression changed, not gradually, but all at once, the color draining slightly from her face as the connection formed fully, and she took a step back, not because she was told to, but because something in her understood that the space she had occupied no longer belonged to her. And the event director exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair as he turned toward his staff, then back to Naomi. We were told Carter Holdings would be represented by a team, he said, grasping for structure, for something procedural that might stabilize the moment, and Naomi gave a small nod. It was, she said. I just chose to walk in without announcing it. And that sentence settled differently than the others, because it revealed intention, not accident, and intention carries accountability. And the server near the back, who had set the tray down earlier, took another step forward, now fully invested in what was unfolding. They did not even check her name, he said quietly, to no one in particular, but loud enough for those around him to hear, and a few heads turned toward him, because witnesses matter in moments like this, not because they changed the outcome, but because they confirmed the truth. And the room was beginning to fill with those confirmations, one voice at a time. And Naomi finally lifted her hand, not to erase what had been done, but to acknowledge it, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the frosting, as if marking the moment, rather than removing it. And when she spoke again, her words were directed at no one person and everyone at once. You built an entire evening around access, she said. Who belongs, who qualifies, who gets to stand where? And she paused just long enough for the room to absorb the statement before continuing. And then you made a decision based on what you saw instead of what you knew. And the distinction cut deeper than any raised voice could have, because it exposed the exact point where assumption had replaced verification. And Emily opened her mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out, because there was no version of the story where that decision looked reasonable anymore. And across the ballroom, more phones continued to light up, more messages, more confirmations, more quiet acknowledgments that what had been expected was no longer happening. And Naomi lowered her hand, her posture unchanged, her presence still anchored, as the final layer of illusion in the room gave way to something else. Entirely not chaos, not yet, but something closer to accountability, waiting to be named. The silence did not feel empty anymore. It felt heavy, like the room itself was holding something it could not release. And every person standing beneath those chandeliers understood in their own way that the night had already changed direction, and there was no version of it that could return to what it was 10 minutes ago. and Naomi Carter remained at the center of that shift, not elevated, not performing, not demanding attention, but existing in a way that made everything else adjust around her. And the numbers on the screen at the far end of the ballroom continued to update, not quickly now, but steadily, as if confirming that what had already happened was not temporary, it was final, and a low murmur spread again, not laughter this time, but calculation, people checking their messages, refreshing their screens, calling assistants who were no longer answering with certainty, but with questions, and the event director took another step forward, then stopped again, as if unsure where to place himself in a space that no longer followed his authority, and he cleared his throat quietly, trying to regain a structure that had already dissolved. "We can resolve this," he said, his voice controlled but strained. "There must be some misunderstanding about the allocation terms or the timing. We can pause and discuss this privately." And the word privately lingered in the air like an offer that might have worked minutes ago, but now sounded like retreat, and Naomi turned her head slightly toward him, not dismissive, but not accepting either, and she let a second pass before responding, as if allowing the weight of his suggestion to settle first. "There is nothing to resolve," she said. "You already made the only decision that mattered." And the simplicity of that sentence left no space for negotiation, because it reframed the entire situation not as a misunderstanding, but as a consequence. And across the room, a woman near the entrance stepped closer, holding her phone in both hands. "The secondary sponsors are withdrawing too," she said, to no one in particular, her voice unsteady, as if she had not planned to speak, but could not keep the information to herself. And another man responded almost immediately. "They are reacting to Carter Holdings pulling out. It is a cascade effect." And the phrase cascade effect moved through the room quickly, because it explained what people were seeing in a way that felt both technical and undeniable, and the master of ceremonies quietly stepped back out of view, his role no longer relevant in a night that had lost its script. And Emily Rhodes stood frozen, where she was, her earlier confidence replaced by something less visible, but more real, not just uncertainty, but awareness, because the room was no longer aligning with her, and alignment is what had given her authority in the first place, and without it she was just another voice among many. And Naomi finally shifted her stance, just slightly, not to leave, not to retreat, but to reposition herself, as if preparing for what came next, and her eyes moved across the room again, not searching, not judging, but observing the reactions, the calculations, the quiet realizations that were unfolding in real time. And for a brief moment, her expression softened, not with sympathy, but with recognition. Because she had seen this before, not in rooms this large or deals this public, but in smaller moments that carried the same pattern, and her mind moved there, without warning, a memory, rising not as a distraction, but as context. She was 24 years old, standing in the lobby of a charity fundraiser in Atlanta, dressed carefully chosen navy suit, heels that had taken 2 paychecks to afford, her name printed on a confirmation email that she had read 3 times before arriving. And the woman at the check-in desk had looked at her, then at the list, then back at her again, with a smile that did not include her eyes. "We do not have you on the list," she had said, even after Naomi showed the confirmation, even after she spelled her name slowly, even after she offered to wait and verify. And the people behind her had been checked in without question, without pause, without proof. And she remembered standing there, feeling the weight of every glance, every assumption, every silent agreement, that she did not fit the image of the room. And she remembered leaving, not because she was told to, but because she understood that staying would not change anything that night. And that memory did not bring anger now, it brought clarity, because the pattern had not changed, only the scale had. And Naomi returned to the present. Without visible transition, her posture still composed, her voice still steady, and when she spoke again, it carried something deeper, not louder, not sharper, but grounded in that history. "This is not about a mistake," she said. "It is about a pattern." And the word pattern settled differently than anything before it, because it expanded the moment beyond the room, beyond the night, into something larger, something harder to dismiss. And a man near the back, who had remained silent until now, took a step forward, his expression thoughtful rather than reactive. "She is right," he said quietly. "I have seen this happen before, not exactly like this, but close enough." And his admission shifted the atmosphere again, because it introduced validation from within the audience, not imposed, not requested, but offered. And the server, who had spoken earlier, nodded slightly, as if confirming what had already been understood, and Naomi did not acknowledge them directly, but her gaze moved briefly in their direction. recognizing their presence, their role as witnesses in a moment that was no longer isolated, and the event director exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping just enough to reveal that he understood what was happening even if he did not know how to stop it. "If we had known who you were," he began, and Naomi raised a hand slightly, not to silence him, but to stop the sentence before it finished. "That is exactly the problem," she said, and her tone remained even, but the meaning landed with precision. "You did not need to know who I was to treat me with respect." And the room absorbed that in silence because it removed the last possible defense, the last argument, that this had been an issue of identity rather than behavior, and Emily's voice came again, this time quieter, less certain. "I did not mean for any of this to happen," she said, and the statement sounded less like an explanation and more like a realization spoken out loud, and Naomi looked at her fully for the first time since the moment began, not with hostility, not with triumph, but with clarity. "Intent does not erase impact," she said, and the words did not echo, but they stayed because they did not need repetition to be understood, and across the ballroom the numbers on the screen stabilized, no longer dropping, no longer changing, because the process was complete, and the final figure sat there visible to everyone, a confirmation that the funding was gone, not paused, not delayed, but removed, and the room adjusted again, not in chaos, but in acceptance, because once something becomes final, people stop reacting and start adapting, and Naomi Carter stood there still, composed, still anchored, her presence unchanged, while everything else recalibrated around the reality she had just revealed, and in that moment the power in the room was no longer assumed, it was defined clearly, quietly, and without negotiation. The room did not collapse, it reorganized itself around a new center, and that center was no longer the stage, no longer the sponsors, no longer the carefully printed program that had promised announcements and applause. It was Naomi Carter standing still with quiet authority, while every other element adjusted to her presence, and the first thing to change was distance, because people who had once stood comfortably close to Emily Rhodes now stepped back, not dramatically, not in panic, but in recognition that proximity now carried a different meaning and a different consequence. And the event director lowered his phone slowly, as if the weight of what he had just read had settled into his posture, and he glanced toward the exit, then back to Naomi, then toward the screen again, searching for something that would restore the evening to a place he understood, but nothing presented itself, and for the first time since the doors had opened that night, the room felt unscripted, not chaotic, but honest, in a way that exposed everything it had tried to conceal. And Naomi remained composed, her breathing steady, her shoulders relaxed, her presence unchanged, as if she had been prepared for this exact moment long before anyone else realized it would happen, and she lifted her phone again, not urgently, not reactively, but with purpose, and when she spoke her tone carried the same clarity as before. "Daniel confirmed the withdrawal is complete across all divisions, including secondary allocations and discretionary commitments." And the response came almost immediately, clear and efficient through the speaker. "Confirmed, all funds have been reallocated and all pending agreements tied to this event have been terminated effective immediately. No residual commitments remain." And the words did not echo, but they settled into the room like a final entry in a ledger, closing a chapter that could not be reopened, and a man near the front shook his head slowly. "That is everything," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. And a woman beside him whispered, "That was the entire foundation of tonight." And the realization spread again, not as a shock this time, but as confirmation, because what had been uncertain minutes ago was now fully defined, and the master of ceremonies stepped forward again, hesitantly holding the edges of his script as if it might still be relevant. But when he looked at Naomi, and then at the screen, he stopped mid-step, his role no longer aligned with the reality in front of him, and he quietly stepped back, once more disappearing into the background of a moment that no longer needed narration, and Emily Rhodes stood motionless, her earlier posture replaced by something less structured, less certain, her hands now clasped lightly in front of her as if trying to contain a reaction she could not fully control, and she looked around the room searching for the same agreement she had felt before, but it was gone, replaced by distance, by observation, by a quiet judgment that had shifted direction. And she turned back to Naomi, her voice lower now. "We did not know," she said, and the statement sounded less like a defense and more like an admission, and Naomi's gaze met hers evenly. "You did not ask," she replied, and the distinction landed with precision because it removed the last layer of justification, the final attempt to frame the moment as ignorance rather than assumption. And across the ballroom, a small group of guests moved closer, not intrusively, but intentionally, forming a loose circle around the space where Naomi stood, as if drawn by the gravity of what had just unfolded, and among them the server who had spoken earlier stepped forward fully, now his posture straight, his voice steady. "I watched what happened from the beginning," he said, and the room shifted slightly toward him, because witnesses do not just observe, they anchor the truth in moments where perception can shift. She walked in calmly, she gave her name, she did not interrupt anyone, she did not demand anything, and she was treated like she did not belong before anyone checked anything. And his words filled the silence in a way that no one contested because they aligned with what people had already seen, even if they had not acknowledged it out loud. And the man in the navy suit nodded once. "That is exactly what happened," he said, confirming the account not as a statement of opinion, but as fact. And Naomi did not interrupt them. She did not add to their words. She allowed them to exist, because truth does not need to be repeated when it is already recognized. And the event director stepped forward again, this time without the posture of authority but with the weight of responsibility. "Ms. Carter," he said, carefully choosing each word, "on behalf of this organization, I want to acknowledge that what happened was unacceptable, and it does not reflect our values or our standards." And the phrasing was polished, familiar, practiced, but something in the room resisted it, because statements like that are designed for recovery, not accountability. And Naomi listened without expression, her posture unchanged, her eyes steady. And when he finished, she let a brief silence settle before responding. "Your values are not what you say they are," she said. "They are what you enforce when it matters." And the sentence shifted the conversation again, because it removed the comfort of language and replaced it with the reality of action. And the event director nodded slowly, absorbing the correction without argument, because there was no argument left to make. And Emily took a small step forward, her voice quieter than before. "What happens now?" she asked, and the question did not carry defiance, it carried uncertainty, the kind that comes when a system no longer supports you. And Naomi turned her head slightly, considering the question, not for long, but long enough to show that the answer was deliberate. "Now the consequences catch up to the behavior," she said, and she lifted her phone once more, her fingers moving across the screen with calm precision. And when she spoke again, her tone did not change, but the effect of her words did. "Daniel, initiate internal review, flag the event contract and all associated personnel. I want a full audit of decision-making authority and compliance with guest protocol effective immediately." And the response came just as quickly. "Understood, initiating audit and notifying legal and compliance teams now." And across the room, another set of phones lit up, not with financial alerts this time, but with internal notifications, messages that carried a different kind of weight, one that extended beyond the evening into something more permanent. And the event director closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again, as if accepting what had just been set in motion. And Emily's shoulders dropped slightly, the last trace of her earlier certainty replaced by the understanding that this moment would not end when the room emptied. It would continue in reports and reviews and consequences that reached further than the space they occupied. And Naomi Carter lowered her phone once more, her presence unchanged, her expression steady, and for the first time since the moment began, she reached for a napkin from a nearby table, not hurried, not reactive, but intentional, and she lightly removed the remaining trace of frosting from her cheek, not to erase what had happened, but to mark that it was complete. And when she looked up again, the room did not feel the same, not because of what had been taken away, but because of what had been revealed. And no one in that ballroom misunderstood it anymore. The power had not shifted, it had been identified, and it was no longer open to interpretation. The room no longer waited for something to happen, it waited for what came next, because there is a difference between witnessing a shift and understanding that the shift is not over. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of that realization, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, while the weight of what she had already done continued to settle into every corner of the ballroom. And the conversations that began to rise again were no longer whispers of confusion, they were calculations of consequence, quiet, urgent exchanges between people who understood that the loss of $4.2 billion was not just a financial absence, it was a structural collapse. And the man in the navy suit stepped closer, once more, his voice measured but direct. This will not just affect tonight, this will ripple through every partnership tied to this event, every vendor, every commitment scheduled after this. He said, and Naomi gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. It already has. She replied, and her tone carried no satisfaction, no emphasis, just fact, and the simplicity of it made the statement heavier because it confirmed that what they were trying to process had already moved beyond their control. And across the room the event director received another notification, his eyes scanning quickly, then stopping as his expression tightened, and he looked up toward Naomi again, this time, without pretense. They are requesting an immediate call from our executive board, he said, and Naomi's gaze remained steady. They should have requested that before the decision was made, she answered, and the distinction settled again because it reframed urgency as delay and delay as responsibility. And Emily Rhodes shifted her weight slightly, her composure now fully replaced by the awareness of being seen, not admired, not followed, but evaluated, and she looked toward the guests who had once mirrored her tone and found none of that reflection remaining, only distance, only observation, and she spoke again, her voice quieter, almost searching. I did what I thought was appropriate based on what I saw, she said, and Naomi's eyes moved to her with calm precision. Exactly, she replied, and the single word held more correction than a paragraph could have carried because it confirmed the problem without needing to expand it. And the server, who had stepped forward earlier, remained nearby, no longer uncertain, no longer silent, his presence steady, as if he had crossed an invisible line from observer to participant. And a woman near the edge of the gathering circle spoke up, now her voice clear. This is not the first time something like this has happened at events like this, she said, and several heads turned toward her, because the statement expanded the moment again beyond the room, beyond the evening, into something systemic, something familiar, and she continued, it is always the same pattern, assumptions made before verification, decisions made before facts. And her words aligned with what had already been said, what had already been proven, and Naomi listened without interruption, her posture unchanged, because the truth did not need her to lead it anymore, it was standing on its own. And the event director exhaled slowly, his shoulders dropping further, as if releasing the last attempt to maintain control. We are going to have to issue a formal statement immediately, he said, and Naomi tilted her head slightly. You can issue whatever statement you need, she said, but statements do not correct behavior. Accountability does. And the distinction landed again because it removed the illusion that this moment could be managed with language alone. And across the ballroom the screens remained unchanged, the final funding status still displayed, as a quiet reminder that the foundation of the night had not been shaken, it had been removed, and the master of ceremonies stood at the edge of the stage, now holding the microphone, without using it, his role reduced to observation, like so many others in the room. And the atmosphere no longer carried the expectation of celebration, it carried the presence of consequence, a shift from performance to reality that could not be reversed by adjusting the lighting or restarting the program. And Naomi finally took a small step forward, not toward the exit, not toward the stage, but simply forward into the space that had formed around her, and the movement drew the attention of the entire room, not because it was dramatic, but because it was intentional, and she looked around once more, not scanning, not searching, but acknowledging every face, every reaction, every moment that had contributed to what now existed. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every word before it. Respect is not based on recognition, she said. It is based on how you treat people before you know who they are. And the sentence did not rise, it did not demand, it settled into the room like a truth that had always been there, but had not been spoken out loud. And the man in the navy suit nodded once more, this time not in calculation, but in agreement, and the server stepped back slightly, returning to his position, not because his role was finished, but because it had been fulfilled. And Emily Rhodes lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, not to challenge, not to defend, but to understand, and that was the shift that mattered. Not the loss of funding, not the collapse of the event, but the change in perspective that had been forced into the open. And Naomi Carter stood there, composed, steady, unshaken, her presence unchanged, while everything around her adjusted to the reality she had revealed. And in that moment the room was no longer asking what had just happened, it was understanding why it had happened, and that understanding carried further than any announcement ever could. The room had stopped pretending it was an event and started behaving like a consequence, and the difference was visible in the way people stood, no longer angled toward the stage or the cameras, but toward Naomi Carter, as if orientation itself had been redefined, and the conversations that filled the air now carried a different tone, not curated, not controlled, but honest in a way that exposed the fragility of everything that had been built for the evening. And the event director remained where he was, his phone now held lower, not because the messages had stopped, but because the meaning of them had settled in, and there was nothing left to confirm. And he looked at Naomi again, this time, without posture, without positioning, just direct. "The board wants to speak with you immediately," he said, and the urgency in his voice was no longer disguised as professionalism. It was plain, and Naomi did not move toward him. She did not step away from where she stood. She simply responded, "They can speak with my office tomorrow morning." And the sentence landed with a different kind of authority, because it set a boundary not just of time, but of control. And the event director nodded slowly, understanding that access was no longer assumed, it was granted. And that realization alone shifted the power dynamic more than anything else that had happened so far. And across the room, a man near the back let out a quiet laugh, not mocking, not dismissive, but recognizing. "She just rescheduled the board of directors," he said, and the words spread quickly because they captured the essence of what people were witnessing, not just financial authority, but structural control. And Emily Rhodes heard it too, her eyes moving across the room, as if seeing it for the first time, not the people, not the space, but the shift in how they were all responding to Naomi. And she took a small step forward, her voice careful, now measured in a way that suggested she understood the weight of what she was about to say. "I would like to apologize," she said, and the room quieted again, not because apologies were unexpected, but because this one carried more than formality. It carried exposure. And Naomi looked at her, not interrupting, not encouraging, simply allowing the moment to exist. And Emily continued, "What I did was based on an assumption that should not have been made, and I understand now that it affected more than just this moment." And her words were steady, but there was something beneath them, not performance, not defense, but realization. And Naomi listened fully before responding, and when she did, her tone did not shift, it remained consistent, grounded. "An apology acknowledges what happened," she said. "Accountability addresses what allowed it to happen." And the distinction settled into the room once more, because it separated the act from the system. And systems are harder to confront than actions. And Emily lowered her gaze briefly, then lifted it again, not in defiance, but in acceptance, because there was no argument left to make. And nearby, the server, who had stepped forward earlier, nodded once, as if confirming the point, not out loud, but in presence. And a woman standing beside him spoke quietly. "That is the difference people do not want to deal with," she said, and her voice carried just enough to be heard by those closest to her, and they nodded in agreement, because the statement resonated beyond the room, beyond the event, into something broader, something familiar. And Naomi Carter remained steady, her posture unchanged, her presence still anchoring the space, while the understanding continued to expand outward. And she took a slow breath, not visible, not emphasized, but present. And then she spoke again, this time not to one person, but to the room as a whole. "You built a system that filters people before it verifies them," she said, "and tonight that system failed because it relied on perception instead of fact." And the words carried through the space without resistance, because the evidence had already been displayed, not argued, not debated, but shown in real time. And the man in the navy suit stepped closer again, this time with a different posture, not investigative, not questioning, but aligned. "What you are describing is not just this event, it is how most of these rooms operate," he said, and Naomi gave a slight nod. "Then most of these rooms need to change," she replied, and the simplicity of that response removed any sense of exaggeration, because it did not dramatize the issue, it stated the requirement. And across the ballroom, the screens remained fixed, the final funding status still visible, a constant reminder that the shift was not temporary. It was complete, and the master of ceremonies lowered the microphone entirely, now placing it on the stand, as if acknowledging that the program no longer applied. And the event director took another step back, not retreating, but repositioning himself within a structure that had already been redefined. And Naomi finally moved again, one small step forward, and then another, not toward any specific destination, but through the space that had opened around her. And people adjusted, instinctively creating room, not out of instruction, but out of recognition. And as she walked, her pace remained even, unhurried, her presence unchanged. and the room followed, not physically, not in movement, but in attention, because every step she took confirmed that control had not been taken, it had been revealed, and she stopped near the center of the ballroom, once more turning slightly, so that her voice would carry evenly when she spoke again. What happened tonight will be documented, reviewed, and addressed, she said, not because it is unusual, but because it is common, and that is the problem. And the sentence settled deeper than the others because it removed any attempt to isolate the moment as an exception and instead positioned it as part of a pattern that required correction, and the event director nodded again, this time without hesitation. "We will cooperate fully with the review," he said, and Naomi met his gaze briefly. "You will not be cooperating with me," she replied. "You will be cooperating with your own standards." And the distinction clarified responsibility in a way that could not be redirected or diluted, and across the room more phones buzzed, more messages arrived, not with confusion, but with direction. Internal teams already responding to the audit that had been initiated, processes beginning that would extend beyond the evening into something lasting, and Emily Rhodes stood still, her earlier presence replaced by quiet awareness, and she spoke once more, not to defend, not to explain, but to acknowledge. "I understand," she said, and Naomi looked at her one final time, not with judgment, not with approval, but with clarity. "Understanding is where it starts," she said. "Change is what proves it." And the words closed the space between statement and expectation, leaving no ambiguity about what would follow, and the room held that moment not in silence, but in recognition. Because what had been revealed could not be unseen, and Naomi Carter stood there, composed, steady, her presence unchanged, while everything else adjusted to the reality that had been made visible. And in that moment the event was no longer defined by what had been planned, but by what had been exposed, and that difference would carry far beyond the walls of the ballroom long after the lights dimmed and the guests left, because the shift that had occurred was not temporary, it was structural, and everyone in that room knew it, whether they admitted it or not. The room no longer felt like a place where something had gone wrong, it felt like a place where something had been revealed and could not be hidden again, and that difference carried weight in the way people stood, in the way they spoke, in the way they looked at Naomi Carter, not as a guest, not as an interruption, but as the axis around which the entire night now turned, and the conversations that had once been fragmented began to align, not around confusion, but around understanding and the man in the navy suit remained close, his presence no longer investigative, but reflective. "What you did tonight did not just stop a deal," he said, "it exposed the system behind it." And Naomi gave a slight nod, not acknowledging praise, but confirming accuracy. "Systems do not collapse because of one decision," she said, "they collapse because of the decisions that led to it." And the words carried through the room with quiet precision, because they shifted the focus again away from the moment and onto the structure that produced it. And across the ballroom the event director stood with a group of senior staff members, now no longer directing, but listening, their posture different, their tone lower, as if they were already preparing for what would follow beyond the evening. And one of them spoke, quietly. "Legal has confirmed the audit request. They are mobilizing a full review team." And the event director nodded once, his eyes briefly closing, as if accepting the scale of what had been set in motion, and Naomi did not look toward them. She did not need to, because the process she had initiated was already moving independently of her presence, and that is what real authority does. It does not require constant reinforcement, it continues without it. And Emily Rhodes remained where she stood, her earlier position now replaced by stillness, not frozen, but grounded in a realization that had not yet fully settled, and she looked toward Naomi again, her voice measured, but sincere. "Is there anything I can do to correct this?" she asked, and the question carried something different this time, not an attempt to recover control, but an attempt to understand responsibility, and Naomi considered her for a moment, not long enough to suggest hesitation, but long enough to show that the answer mattered. "Correction does not begin with action," she said. "It begins with recognition of what allowed the action in the first place." And the distinction landed again, because it redirected the question from immediate repair to deeper accountability, and Emily nodded slowly, absorbing that nod as instruction, but as truth, and nearby the woman, who had spoken earlier, stepped closer, her presence steady. "People think these moments are isolated," she said, "but they are not, they are repeated, until someone refuses to accept them." And her words aligned with everything that had unfolded, reinforcing the pattern that Naomi had already named, and the server who had stood as witness gave a small nod in agreement, his role now quiet again, but not diminished because what he had said remained in the room as part of its foundation, and Naomi Carter remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence still anchoring the space, while the next layer of understanding began to form, and she turned slightly not toward any one person, but toward the wider room, her voice carrying evenly without effort. "What you saw tonight is not new," she said. "It is simply visible now because it was challenged in a way that could not be ignored." And the sentence settled with clarity because it removed any illusion that this was an isolated event. Instead, it framed it as part of something ongoing, something systemic, and the man in the navy suit exhaled slowly. "And that visibility changes everything," he said, and Naomi met his gaze briefly. "Only if it leads to action," she replied, and the condition within that response held weight because it made clear that awareness alone was not enough, and across the ballroom more guests began to step closer, not crowding, not intruding, but gathering in a way that reflected a shift in alignment, no longer passive observers, but active witnesses to something that now demanded attention. And the event director approached again, his posture different from before, no longer attempting to manage, but to address. "We are suspending the remainder of the program effective immediately," he said, "and we will be initiating a full internal review of all procedures related to guest verification and event access." And his words were no longer framed as a statement for optics, they were spoken with the understanding that they would be measured against action, and Naomi gave a slight nod acknowledging the step without endorsing it because acknowledgement is not the same as approval, and Emily looked toward him, then back to Naomi, her expression steady. "I will cooperate fully with the review," she said, and Naomi's response was immediate, but calm. "You will participate in it," she said. Cooperation suggested is optional, and the correction refined the language, once more aligning it with the reality of the situation, and Emily accepted that without resistance, because resistance had no place left in the room, and the master of ceremonies now stood completely still at the edge of the stage, his role fully dissolved, his presence reduced to observation like so many others, and the lighting in the ballroom remained unchanged, but the atmosphere had shifted entirely, no longer carrying anticipation, but carrying consequence, and Naomi took another slow step forward, her movement deliberate, her pace unchanged, and as she did, the space adjusted again, people creating room not out of instruction, but out of recognition, and she stopped near the center, once more her gaze moving across the room, one final time, not searching, not evaluating, but acknowledging the collective shift that had taken place, and when she spoke again, her voice remained steady, grounded. "Respect is not something you extend when it is convenient," she said. "It is something you practice consistently, or not at all." And the words held the room in place because they did not accuse, they defined, and definitions are harder to reject than opinions, and the man in the navy suit nodded once more, this time with certainty. "That is the standard," he said, and Naomi replied simply, "That is the expectation." And the distinction between the two settled into the room because standards can exist without being met, expectations require fulfillment, and across the ballroom the final notifications continued to arrive, not with urgency, but with direction, processes now in motion, reviews being scheduled, actions being prepared, and Naomi Carter lowered her hands to her sides, her posture unchanged, her presence still calm and controlled, as everything around her adjusted to the new reality that had been established. And in that moment, there was no need for further explanation, no need for additional action, because the outcome had already been set in motion, and the room understood it fully, not as a reaction, but as a result. And Naomi Carter did not raise her voice, she did not demand attention, she simply stood in the center of a system that had been exposed, and in doing so she had changed it in a way that could not be reversed, and everyone in that room knew it, whether they spoke it out loud or carried it with them in silence. The room had reached a point where nothing more needed to be proven, and yet everything still needed to be understood, and that tension settled quietly across every face, every posture, every breath, as Naomi Carter remained at the center of it, not as a figure demanding attention, but as the reason attention could no longer be misplaced, and the conversations that continued around her had shifted again, no longer focused on what had happened, but on what it meant, and meaning travels further than events because it lingers, it repeats, it reshapes behavior long after the moment itself has passed. And the man in the navy suit stood with his hands loosely at his sides, his voice lower, now reflective rather than analytical. "There are people in this room who will leave tonight, and pretend this was an exception. He said, and Naomi's gaze met his briefly. And there are people who will not be able to. She replied, and the distinction carried weight, because it acknowledged both reactions without validating either one, and across the ballroom a quiet recalibration continued, guests adjusting their positions, their conversations, their expectations, as if the rules of the room had been rewritten in real time, and the event director stood near the edge of the gathering, speaking into his phone in a low voice, no longer issuing instructions, but receiving them. His posture aligned with someone who understood that authority had moved beyond him and into a process that would not reverse itself. And Emily Rhodes remained still, her earlier certainty replaced by a kind of awareness that does not come quickly but arrives all at once. And she looked toward Naomi again, not searching for approval, not expecting forgiveness, but trying to understand the distance between what she had believed and what had been revealed. And Naomi did not close that distance, she allowed it to exist, because some distances are necessary not as punishment, but as clarity. And the server, who had stepped forward earlier, now returned to his role, quietly picking up a tray from a nearby table, but his presence remained different, no longer invisible, no longer part of the background, but part of the moment that had shaped the room. And a guest standing beside him spoke softly. "You said what most people would not say." And he gave a small nod, not accepting praise but acknowledging truth, because truth does not require validation, it requires recognition. And Naomi Carter remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, while the final layer of the evening began to unfold, not through action, but through realization. And she took a slow step forward, then another, her movement unhurried, deliberate, and the room responded instinctively, creating space, not because it was asked, but because it was understood. And she stopped near the center, once more, her gaze moving across the room, one last time, not scanning, not evaluating, but acknowledging the shift that had taken place. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every word before it. "What happened tonight will not stay in this room," she said, not because it needs to be repeated, but because it reflects something that already exists beyond it. And the sentence settled deeply because it extended the moment outward beyond the ballroom into a larger context, one that could not be contained by walls or dismissed as an isolated incident. And the man in the navy suit nodded slowly. "People will talk about this," he said, and Naomi's response came without hesitation. "They should talk about why it happened," she replied, and the emphasis redirected the focus once more away from spectacle and toward cause. And across the ballroom the screens remained unchanged, the final status still visible, a quiet constant that required no explanation. And the master of ceremonies stepped fully away from the stage now, placing the microphone down completely, as if acknowledging that the evening had reached its true conclusion, not the one that had been planned, but the one that had been revealed. And the event director approached Naomi one final time, his posture respectful, his tone measured. "We will be issuing a full report and implementing immediate changes to our procedures," he said, and Naomi met his gaze briefly. "Make sure those changes are measurable," she replied, "otherwise they are just statements." And the clarity of that response left no room for interpretation, because it defined accountability not as intention, but as action. And the event director nodded once more, accepting the standard that had been set not by policy, but by reality. And Emily Rhodes took a small step forward, her voice steady but quiet. "I understand now that what I did was not just a mistake, it was part of something larger," she said, and Naomi looked at her, not with judgment, not with approval, but with truth. "Understanding is the first step," she said, "but it is not the last." And the distinction held firm because it placed responsibility on what would follow, not on what had been said. And across the room more guests began to move, not toward the exit, but toward each other, conversations forming that were no longer about networking or opportunity, but about reflection, about recognition, about a shift that had been forced into visibility. And Naomi Carter lowered her hands to her sides, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded, as the room continued to adjust around her. And she took one final breath, not emphasized, not visible, but present. And then she turned slightly, her movement signaling not an end, but a transition. And as she did, the space responded once more, not with resistance, not with uncertainty, but with understanding. And in that moment, there was no need for further words, no need for additional action, because everything that needed to be revealed had already been made clear. And Naomi Carter did not raise her voice. She did not seek acknowledgement. She simply stood within the truth that had been exposed. And in doing so, she left behind something more powerful than the event itself. She left behind a standard, and standards do not disappear. When the room empties, they follow people, they shape decisions, they redefine expectations, and everyone in that ballroom understood that whether they admitted it out loud or carried it with them in silence as they prepared to leave a night that would not be remembered for what it promised, but for what it revealed. The room did not empty immediately because no one wanted to be the first to leave a moment that had already begun to define something larger than the event itself. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of that pause, not holding anyone there, not asking for attention, but existing in a way that made departure feel incomplete. And the quiet conversations that formed around the space now carried a different weight, not speculative, not uncertain, but reflective, as if each person was measuring what they had just witnessed against what they had accepted before. And the man in the navy suit remained nearby, his voice low but clear. "What you did tonight will travel far beyond this room," he said, and Naomi's gaze moved toward him briefly. "It should travel to the places where this is still considered normal," she replied, and the calm certainty in her voice removed any sense of exaggeration, because what had been revealed was not new, it had simply been undeniable. And across the ballroom, the event director stood with his team, no longer directing movement, but organizing response, his tone controlled, but no longer authoritative. "We need a full record of everything that occurred from the moment she arrived to the moment the funding was withdrawn," he said, and one of his staff members nodded quickly, already taking notes, already documenting a timeline that would soon become evidence not just of an incident, but of a system failure. And Emily Rhodes remained where she was, her posture still, but not frozen, her expression no longer searching, but processing, and she looked toward Naomi again, not with expectation, not with hope, but with an understanding that had settled deeper than any apology could reach. And she spoke once more, her voice steady but quiet. "I thought I was protecting the image of the event," she said, and Naomi met her gaze without hesitation. "You protected an image by excluding a person," she replied. "And that is exactly how systems like this continue to exist." And the clarity of that statement did not accuse, it defined, and definitions are harder to ignore than reactions. And Emily lowered her eyes briefly, then lifted them again, not in defense, but in acceptance, because the truth had already been established, and there was nothing left to argue against. And nearby, the server, who had stood as witness, leaned slightly toward another staff member, speaking in a low voice. "This is going to change how they train us, how they check people, everything," he said, and the other staff member nodded slowly. "It should have already been that way," she replied, and their exchange carried a quiet weight because it reflected the part of the system that often remains unseen, the people who operate within it, but do not control it. And Naomi Carter remained composed, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, while the room continued to recalibrate around the reality she had revealed. And she took a small step forward, then another, her movement unhurried, deliberate, and as she moved, the space adjusted again, not out of instruction, but out of recognition, and she stopped near the edge of the gathering, her gaze moving across the room one final time, not searching, not evaluating, but acknowledging the shift that had taken place. And when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had defined every word before it. "What you do after this moment is what determines whether it mattered," she said, and the sentence settled deeply, because it placed responsibility not on what had already happened, but on what would follow. And the man in the navy suit nodded once more. "That is where most people fall short," he said, and Naomi responded simply. "That is where most systems fail." And the distinction between people and systems held meaning because it clarified that change requires both awareness and action. And across the ballroom, more guests began to move toward the exits, slowly, not rushing, not eager, but thoughtful, as if carrying something with them that could not be set down. And the master of ceremonies remained near the stage, his script still in his hand, but no longer relevant, his role now reduced to witnessing the end of something that had not followed its intended path. And the event director approached Naomi one final time, his posture respectful, his tone steady. "We will be in contact with your office regarding the audit and any further actions that are required," he said, and Naomi gave a slight nod. "You will be in contact with your own process first," she replied, "and then with mine." And the distinction reinforced the structure she had already established, one where responsibility could not be redirected or delayed. And the event director accepted that without resistance, because resistance had no place left in the room. and Emily Rhodes stood quietly, her earlier presence replaced by a stillness that suggested reflection rather than reaction, and she spoke one last time, her voice calm but firm. "I will make sure this does not happen again under my watch," she said, and Naomi looked at her with steady clarity. "Make sure it does not happen under any watch," she replied, and the expansion of that statement removed any sense of limitation because the issue had never been confined to one person or one role, and Emily nodded slowly, understanding that the responsibility extended beyond her position into the system itself, and across the room the final conversations continued, not loud, not dramatic, but meaningful, as if each person was carrying a piece of the moment into their own understanding, and Naomi Carter lowered her hands to her sides, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded, and she turned slightly toward the exit, not as an escape, not as a retreat, but as a transition, and as she began to walk, the room responded once more, not with attention, but with acknowledgement, subtle but real, a shift in posture, a pause in conversation, a recognition that the person who had just redefined the space was now leaving it. And as she moved, her pace remained, even her expression composed, her presence consistent, and the room did not follow her. It did not need to, because what she had left behind remained, and that was the difference between influence and impact. Influence fades when the person leaves. Impact remains and continues to shape what follows. And Naomi Carter reached the edge of the ballroom, her hand resting briefly on the door, not to hesitate, but to mark the moment, and for a second, she paused, not turning back, not looking for reaction, but allowing the weight of what had been revealed to settle fully, and then she stepped forward, leaving the room behind, not as it had been, but as it now was, changed, defined, and unable to return to what it had been before, and everyone who remained understood that, whether they spoke it out loud or carried it quietly within themselves. The night had not ended, it had shifted into something that would continue long after the doors closed and the lights dimmed, and the silence that followed would not erase what had happened, it would carry it forward. The hallway outside the ballroom felt quieter, but not empty, because silence carries differently when it follows something that cannot be undone, and Naomi Carter stepped into that space, without slowing her pace, her heels steady against the polished floor, her posture unchanged, as if nothing about her had shifted, even though everything around her had, and behind her the doors to the ballroom remained closed, not to contain what had happened, but because what had happened no longer needed containment. It had already begun to move beyond those walls, and into conversations, into decisions, into systems that would now be forced to confront what had been exposed. And Naomi did not look back. She did not pause to measure the reaction she had left behind, because the reaction was no longer the point, the result was. And as she moved down the corridor, a man in a dark suit approached from the opposite direction, his expression alert, his pace quick but controlled. "Ms. Carter," he said as he reached her, his tone respectful, "we have been trying to reach you. Your office confirmed the withdrawal, and the board has been in emergency session for the past 10 minutes. And Naomi slowed just slightly, not stopping completely, but enough to acknowledge the information. "They are late," she said calmly, and the man nodded, once understanding the meaning behind the response, not as a dismissal, but as a statement of timing and responsibility, and he continued, "They are requesting a direct call with you as soon as possible." And Naomi's gaze remained forward. "They can request it through the proper channel," she replied, and the man adjusted his stance slightly. "Understood, I will relay that immediately," he said before stepping aside, allowing her to continue without interruption, and that exchange carried the same pattern as everything that had unfolded inside the ballroom. Authority, not announced, not negotiated, but demonstrated through control of access, through control of time. And Naomi continued down the corridor, her pace, even her presence, steady, as if the events behind her had not required effort, but simply clarity. And as she reached the end of the hallway, the glass doors leading to the exterior opened automatically, the night air cooler, quieter, more honest than the curated atmosphere she had just left, and she stepped outside, the city lights stretching across the distance, reflecting off glass and steel, a reminder that the world beyond the ballroom did not operate on invitation lists or assumptions. It operated on outcomes and decisions. And Naomi paused there for a moment, not to reflect, not to reconsider, but to transition, because moments like the one she had just left do not end, they evolve, and she understood that fully. And as she stood there, her phone vibrated once more, and she lifted it to her ear. "Yes," she said, and Daniel's voice came through, clear and precise. The reallocation is complete. All funds have been secured and redirected according to your prior directives. We have also initiated a review of all partnerships connected to the event and identified secondary exposures that may require adjustment. And Naomi listened without interruption. Proceed with the adjustments, she said, and ensure that every entity involved understands the reason for the change, not just the change itself. And Daniel responded immediately. Understood, we will provide full context with each notification. And Naomi lowered the phone slightly, her gaze moving across the skyline, not searching, not analyzing, but acknowledging the scale of what had just been set in motion. And inside the ballroom the consequences were still unfolding, conversations still forming, decisions still being made, but outside the process had already moved forward into something more structured, more permanent. And Naomi Carter did not need to return to that room to influence what would happen next, because influence had already been replaced by action, and action does not require presence to continue. And as she stood there, another voice approached. From behind, measured, cautious, Ms. Carter. And she turned slightly to see the man in the navy suit who had spoken with her earlier, now standing a few feet away, his posture respectful, his expression thoughtful. I wanted to speak with you before you left, he said, and Naomi gave a slight nod, allowing the moment without inviting it. And he continued, what happened tonight will change how a lot of people operate, including me. And the statement was not framed as praise or apology, it was framed as recognition. And Naomi looked at him steadily. Then it mattered, she replied, and the simplicity of that response carried more weight than any extended acknowledgement could have. And the man nodded once. It did, he said, and it will. And the distinction between past and future held meaning, because it confirmed that the moment was not isolated, it was ongoing. And he stepped back slightly, not lingering, not extending the conversation beyond what was necessary, because some acknowledgments do not require continuation. And Naomi turned back toward the city, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded, and for a brief moment, there was nothing else to say, nothing else to initiate, because everything that needed to move forward was already in motion. And that is where real power exists, not in the moment of exposure, but in what follows it, in the systems that adjust, in the standards that shift, in the expectations that no longer accept what was once ignored. And Naomi Carter stood there not as someone who had disrupted an event, but as someone who had redefined a boundary, and boundaries once redefined do not return to their previous position. They establish something new, something that remains even when the moment itself fades. And after a second, she stepped forward again, her movement smooth, deliberate, as she made her way toward the waiting car at the curb. The driver already stepping out to open the door, his posture respectful, his timing precise. And Naomi did not pause, she did not hesitate. She entered the car with the same composure she had carried throughout the entire evening. And as the door closed behind her, the city outside continued to move unchanged, unaware of the shift that had just taken place within one ballroom among many. But that is how change often begins, not with announcements, not with headlines, but with moments that redefine what is acceptable and what is not. And inside the car, Naomi Carter sat back, her expression calm, her mind clear, not replaying what had happened, not questioning what had been done, because neither was necessary. The decision had been made, the action had been taken, and the result was already unfolding. And as the car pulled away from the curb, the building behind her remained lit, the ballroom still active, the conversation still ongoing. But Naomi did not look back, because what she had left behind was no longer hers to manage. It belonged to those who had been part of it, those who would now have to respond to it. And that response would determine whether the moment became a turning point or just another memory. And Naomi Carter understood that fully, and she had already done her part, not by raising her voice, not by demanding recognition, but by revealing a truth that could no longer be ignored. And in doing so, she had changed the direction of everything that followed. The car moved through the city without urgency, but with purpose, the quiet hum of the engine blending into the rhythm of the streets. As Naomi Carter sat in the back seat, her posture relaxed, but not idle, her presence still carrying the same grounded control that had defined every moment of the evening. And outside the window, the lights of the city reflected in long streaks across the glass buildings, passing by, each one a reminder that the world did not stop for a single event, but it did respond to the decisions made within it. And Naomi's phone vibrated again, not with urgency, but with continuity, and she answered without hesitation. Go ahead, she said, and Daniel's voice came through steady as before. We have received confirmation from 3 additional firms. They are adjusting their positions in response to The withdrawal not out of obligation, but out of alignment with your decision. And Naomi listened carefully because alignment is not automatic, it is chosen, and she responded, document their reasoning, not just their action. I want clarity on whether this is reaction or reflection. And Daniel replied immediately. Understood, we will include qualitative responses along with the data. And Naomi ended the call without further instruction because what needed to happen next had already been set into motion, and that is what defined the difference between control and influence. Control initiates, but influence continues. And as the car turned onto a quieter street, the noise of the city softened slightly, the distance from the ballroom increasing, not just physically, but contextually, because what had happened there was no longer confined to that space. It had already begun to reshape conversations in places. Naomi would never enter rooms. She would never see decisions. She would never directly observe. And yet her presence would be felt in all of them, not through force, but through standard. And she leaned her head back slightly, not in fatigue, but in stillness, allowing the moment to settle, not emotionally, but structurally, because she did not carry what had happened as a burden. She carried it as confirmation, and that distinction defined everything about how she moved forward. And after a few seconds her thoughts shifted, not backward, not replaying the event, but forward to the processes already unfolding, the audit, the communications, the adjustments that would now test whether the system would respond with real change or simply absorb the moment and return to its previous form. And she knew from experience that both outcomes were possible, because systems do not change easily, they adjust slowly unless forced otherwise, and tonight had created that force, not through confrontation, but through exposure, and exposure has a way of accelerating what would otherwise take years. And the driver glanced briefly in the rearview mirror. We will be at your office in 10 minutes, he said, and Naomi gave a slight nod acknowledging the information without shifting her focus. And as the car continued forward, another call came through, this time from a number she recognized, but had not expected, and she answered. This is Carter, she said, and a measured voice responded. Ms. Carter, this is Robert Ellison from the executive board. We understand that you prefer to communicate through your office, but given the immediacy of the situation, we wanted to reach out directly. And Naomi listened without interruption, because urgency often reveals more than preparation, and she replied, the immediacy of the situation was created by a decision made without verification. And the statement did not accuse, it clarified. And there was a brief pause on the other end before Robert responded. We acknowledge that, and we are prepared to address it with full transparency. And Naomi's gaze remained steady forward. Transparency follows accountability, it does not replace it, she said, and the distinction settled into the conversation with the same precision it had carried in the ballroom, and Robert adjusted his tone slightly. We are initiating a full review, and we would value your input as we move forward, he said, and Naomi responded without hesitation. You will have my office's input after your review begins, not before. And the sequence she established was deliberate, because input without process becomes influence without structure, and she did not operate that way, and Robert accepted the boundary. Understood, we will proceed accordingly, he said, and the call ended not abruptly but definitively, because the terms had been set and did not require further discussion. And Naomi lowered her phone, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, as the car approached her office building, the structure rising ahead of them with quiet authority, not extravagant, not performative, but established and consistent. And as the car pulled to a stop, the driver stepped out to open the door, but Naomi had already reached for the handle, not out of impatience, but out of habit, and she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the air cooler here, the noise more distant, the transition from the ballroom now complete. And as she entered the building, the lobby staff greeted her with quiet respect, not because of what had happened that evening, but because of who she was consistently. And that consistency is what defines real authority, not moments, but patterns. And she moved through the lobby without pause, her steps measured, her presence steady, and as the elevator doors opened, she stepped inside alone, the space quiet, enclosed, a contrast to the openness of the ballroom. And as the doors closed, she allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, not reflection, not reconsideration, but alignment, because everything that had been set in motion would now continue without her direct involvement, and that is where the outcome would be determined, not in the moment of action, but in the process that followed it. And the elevator rose smoothly, floor by floor, each level marking a transition from public to private, from exposure to execution, And when the doors opened again, she stepped into her office space, the lighting soft, the atmosphere controlled, the environment designed for clarity rather than performance, and Daniel was already there, standing near the conference table, a tablet in his hand, his posture prepared. We have compiled the initial reports and identified key areas for immediate follow-up, he said, and Naomi moved toward the table, her focus shifting seamlessly from event to execution. Walk me through the structural impact first, not the surface response, she said, and Daniel nodded, already prepared. The immediate withdrawal triggered a cascade across associated partnerships, but more importantly, it has exposed verification gaps in multiple organizations, not just the one hosting the event. And Naomi listened carefully because that was the point, not the event itself, but the system it revealed, and she responded, then we address the gaps, not the symptoms, and we do it in a way that cannot be ignored or reversed. And Daniel acknowledged the directive. Understood, we will prioritize structural changes over temporary measures. And Naomi placed her phone on the table, her posture unchanged, her presence still grounded as the next phase began, not in a ballroom, not in front of an audience, but in a space where decisions are made without performance and impact is measured by outcome and not perception. And in that moment, it was clear that what had started as a single act of disrespect had become something far larger, not because of reaction, but because of response. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of that response, not as someone reacting to a moment, but as someone defining what would follow it. And that is where real power exists, not in what is done to you, but in what you do next, and how it reshapes everything that comes after. The office did not carry the weight of what had happened, it carried the clarity of what would follow, and Naomi Carter stood at the head of the conference table, her presence unchanged, her focus sharpened, not by emotion but by direction, and the screens in front of her displayed not reactions, but structures, diagrams of partnerships, lines of authority, layers of verification protocols that had once been assumed to function, but now stood exposed in their limitations. And Daniel moved through the data with precision, his voice steady. We have identified 12 organizations directly impacted by the withdrawal and 8 additional entities with indirect exposure through shared verification systems. And Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze fixed on the information, not because she needed to understand it, but because she needed to decide what would be done with it. And she spoke with the same calm clarity that had defined every moment of the evening. Then we address all 20, not just the ones directly affected, she said, and the instruction shifted the scale immediately because it expanded the response beyond reaction into reform. And Daniel nodded, adjusting the framework accordingly. We will need to establish a unified standard for guest verification and access control across all affiliated events, he said, and Naomi gave a slight nod. Not just a standard or requirement tied to continued partnership, she replied, and the distinction carried weight because standards can be ignored, requirements cannot. And across the room the team moved with quiet efficiency, updating documents, adjusting timelines, initiating communications that would extend far beyond the office and into systems that had never expected to be questioned. And Naomi stepped slightly to the side, her movement unhurried, her presence still anchoring the space, as she considered the next phase not as a continuation, but as an escalation, because exposure without enforcement changes nothing, and she understood that fully, and she turned back toward the table, her voice steady. I want a compliance framework drafted within 48 hours, measurable, enforceable, and transparent, she said, and Daniel responded immediately, we will have a preliminary version ready within 24 hours for your review. And Naomi accepted that without further adjustment because the process had already aligned with her expectation. And as the discussion continued, the information shifted from identification to implementation. Timelines were established, responsibilities assigned, checkpoints defined not as suggestions, but as commitments, and the room operated without hesitation because clarity removes uncertainty, and Naomi Carter provided that clarity not through volume, but through precision. And after a few moments her phone vibrated again, and she glanced at the screen briefly before answering. Yes, she said, and the voice on the other end carried a different tone, not corporate, not procedural, but public. Ms. Carter, this is Angela Rees from Global Business Network. We are preparing a statement regarding the events this evening and would like to include your perspective. And Naomi listened without interruption because public narrative often attempts to shape perception before truth has time to settle, and she responded, my perspective is already reflected in the actions taken. she said, and Angela paused briefly before continuing. Would you be open to a brief comment to accompany the statement? And Naomi's response remained consistent. Any statement should focus on the system that allowed the event to occur, not the individual moment itself. She said, and the clarity of that directive reframed the narrative before it could be simplified into something easier to consume, and Angela acknowledged it. Understood, we will proceed accordingly. And the call ended, leaving no ambiguity about how the situation would be represented beyond the room, and Naomi returned her attention to the table, her posture unchanged, her presence still steady, as the next layer of work continued, and Daniel stepped forward slightly. We have also identified an opportunity to implement third-party oversight for high-profile events to ensure independent verification processes, he said, and Naomi considered that for a moment, not because it was unexpected, but because it required alignment with the broader structure, and she responded, include it as an optional layer with mandatory adoption for events exceeding a certain scale, define the threshold clearly. And Daniel nodded, already adjusting the framework, and the room continued to move with the same controlled efficiency, each action building on the last, each decision reinforcing the structure that was being created not as a response to one event, but as a correction to a pattern, and Naomi Carter remained at the center of that process. Not overseeing it from a distance, but shaping it directly, her presence ensuring that nothing reverted to assumption, nothing returned to convenience. And after a moment, she stepped back slightly, her gaze moving across the room, not evaluating, not questioning, but confirming that the direction had been set and the execution had begun, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the same quiet authority. This is not about preventing one incident from happening again, she said. It is about removing the conditions that allow it to happen at all. And the sentence settled into the room with clarity because it defined the purpose beyond the immediate outcome, and the team responded not with acknowledgement, but with action, because the expectation had already been established, and across the office the screens continued to update, messages arriving, confirmations being logged, processes moving forward without pause, and Naomi Carter stood there, composed, steady, her presence unchanged, as the final structure began to take form, and in that moment, it was clear that what had started as a single act of disrespect had evolved into something far more significant, not through reaction, not through emotion, but through deliberate, controlled response. And that response would extend far beyond the office, far beyond the organizations directly involved, into a broader standard that would influence how spaces like the one she had left would operate in the future, and Naomi understood that fully, and she did not need to announce it, she did not need to emphasize it, because the work itself would define it. And as the meeting continued, the details refined, the structure, timelines aligned, responsibilities solidified, and the process moved forward with a clarity that left no room for reversal, and Naomi Carter remained at the center of it all, not as a figure of authority demanding change, but as the source of it, ensuring that what had been revealed would not fade into memory, but would become a standard that could not be ignored. And in that moment, the outcome was no longer uncertain, it was defined, and everything that followed would be measured against it. The room had settled into rhythm, not silence, not urgency, but movement, structured, deliberate, aligned with a direction that no longer needed to be explained, and Naomi Carter stood at the center of that rhythm, her presence unchanged, her posture steady, as the final pieces of the framework came together around her, not as reactions, but as decisions that would extend far beyond the walls of the office and into systems that had operated unchecked for too long, and the screens in front of her no longer displayed uncertainty, they displayed structure, protocols, finalized timelines, locked accountability, mapped in a way that removed ambiguity and replaced it with expectation. And Daniel stepped forward once more, his tone precise. The compliance framework has been drafted and circulated to all primary stakeholders. Initial responses indicate full alignment with the enforcement conditions tied to continued partnership. And Naomi listened without interruption, her gaze steady, because alignment at this stage did not signal completion, it signaled commitment, and she responded with quiet clarity. Monitor implementation, not agreement. Agreement is immediate, implementation reveals intent. And the distinction settled into the room because it shifted the focus from what was said to what would be done, and the team adjusted accordingly, refining tracking systems, establishing checkpoints that would not rely on assumption, but on measurable action. And Naomi moved slightly along the table, her steps unhurried, her presence constant, as she reviewed the final structure not for approval, but for integrity, because what had been built here would determine whether the moment that began in that ballroom would become a standard or fade into memory, and she did not allow for the latter, and as the final confirmations came through, the atmosphere in the room shifted again, not in intensity, but in clarity, because everything that needed to be decided had been decided, everything that needed to be initiated had been set in motion, and what remained was execution, and execution does not require noise, it requires consistency, and Naomi Carter embodied that fully, and after a moment, she stepped back slightly, her gaze moving across the room, acknowledging the team, not with words, but with presence, because the work itself carried the recognition, and when she spoke her voice remained calm, grounded. "This does not end with implementation," she said, "it begins there." And the sentence held the room in place because it defined the future not as a conclusion, but as a continuation, and Daniel nodded once. "We will maintain active oversight and adjust where necessary," he said, and Naomi gave a slight nod. "Do not adjust for convenience, adjust for integrity," she replied, and the distinction reinforced the standard once more, ensuring that nothing would revert to the patterns that had been exposed. And across the room, the final reports were compiled, communications prepared, releases structured, not to control perception, but to reflect reality, and Naomi Carter turned slightly, her attention shifting from the table to the larger space beyond it, because what had been built here would now move outward into systems that would either adapt or be left behind, and she understood that fully, and as she walked toward the window, the city stretched out before her, lights steady, constant, a reminder that change does not announce itself, it integrates quietly into the structures that define how things operate. And she stood there for a moment, not reflecting, not revisiting, but acknowledging the scale of what had been set in motion, and behind her the room continued to move, not in urgency, but in alignment, each person operating within a structure that had been clearly defined and would be consistently enforced. And after a second, she turned back toward the room, her presence unchanged, her voice steady. "What happened tonight will not be remembered for the disruption," she said. "It will be remembered for the correction." And the words carried a finality that did not close the moment, but defined it, and the team understood that not as a statement, but as a directive for everything that would follow. And across the office, the systems remained active, processes continuing, data updating, communications extending beyond the building into organizations that would now have to respond not to pressure, but to expectation. And Naomi Carter remained composed, her posture steady, her presence grounded, as the final phase transitioned from creation to enforcement, and she took a slow breath, not visible, not emphasized, but present, and then she spoke one last time, her voice carrying the same quiet authority that had defined every moment from the beginning. "Respect is not something you negotiate after it is denied," she said. "It is something you establish so clearly that denial becomes impossible." And the sentence settled into the room with a weight that did not need repetition, because it defined everything that had happened, everything that had been revealed, and everything that would now follow. And Naomi Carter did not raise her voice, she did not seek acknowledgement, she did not require agreement, she simply stood within the standard she had set, and in doing so ensured that it would continue long after the moment itself had passed, because real power is not in the moment of response, it is in the system that remains after it. And that system had now been changed, not temporarily, not partially, but structurally, and everyone in that room understood that fully, because they were now part of it. And as the night moved forward, the work continued quietly, consistently, without interruption, because the foundation had been reset. And what followed would no longer rely on assumption, it would rely on truth. And Naomi Carter stood at the center of that truth, not as someone who demanded it, but as someone who had revealed it, and in doing so had ensured that it could not be ignored again.